Alright, we're ready for another session of Cornell Notes. Our topic is narrative perspective. We have two essential questions that we're going to be considering as we go through this presentation. The first one is what considerations are important when choosing a narrator, and the second is how do the characteristics of a narrator influence how a story is told. Now I'm really excited to be going over this topic. We've had some confusion in class about this, and hopefully these notes will help to kind of clear things up a little bit. So let's go on and start with our first heading. Our first heading is narrative perspectives. We're going to talk about that first. Every narrator has a perspective that influences how he or she tells a story. There are four main aspects of a narrator's perspective that influence the story's telling. Now, before we kind of continue on, I also wanted to real quickly just kind of give you an overview of how the notes are going to proceed at this point. As you can see, we have four main aspects of a narrator's perspective that we're going to be talking about. We're going to, when we come to each one of those aspects, discuss how that aspect relates to both a first-person point of view narrator and how that aspect relates to a third-person point of view narrator. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, and I think you'll see what I mean as we continue on in our notes here. The first aspect that influences a narrator's perspective and how the narrator tells a story is the narrator's inclusion or exclusion in the story. Now let's see how this aspect influences a first-person point of view narrator. So a first-person point of view narrator is a character in the story and uses the pronouns I and me. Okay, so this is the narrator that is in the story. It's the narrator that is going to be using these pronouns to show that he or she is actually involved in the story, in the conflict, in the plot, in everything that's happening there. A third-person narrator, on the other hand, is an outside observer and uses the pronouns he, she, and they, or other characters' names. So this type of narrator is going to be kind of the eye in the sky that we've talked about in class. The narrator is going to look down at all of the characters and see what's happening, and then describe what's happening to the reader. Now, character traits is the second main aspect of a narrator's perspective. Now, when we're talking about character traits for a first-person narrator, we're talking about a person who's in the story. So, as a character involved in the story, a first-person narrator should have character traits and a personality. The narrator's personality, along with his or her age, gender, race, and life experiences, should all influence how the story is told. So, this is a narrator who is actually, again, a character in the story, and so you have to remember as an author that if you have a first-person narrated story, you need to make sure that you are developing the character traits of that narrator as that narrator kind of goes through the story. So you're not just focusing on other characters, you got to be focused on the narrator as well and developing that narrator's personality. The character traits of a third-person narrator are generally not described by the author. The narrator is simply the voice that tells a story, and he or she doesn't draw attention to his or her role as storyteller. So again, this is in contrast to a first-person point of view narrator. So again, the third-person narrator is just the eye in the sky and is kind of outside of all of the action and just describes it to the reader. And usually in this, in a third-person narrator, you're not going to be getting any information about the character traits of the narrator. Okay, the narrator is not going to be developed by the author at all. Access to other characters' thoughts and feelings is our third aspect that influences a narrator's perspective. Now let's see what this means in terms of a first-person narrator. So a first-person narrator does not know for sure the thoughts, feelings, and opinions of other characters. Because a first-person narrated story is told from just one character's point of view, the reader is limited to knowing only what one character thinks and feels. Now, as human beings, we should be fairly familiar with this perspective because in the story of our own lives, this is the point of view from which we tell our story. We are first-person narrators in our story. We walk around and we see things, we see people, we see events, things take place, and we are limited just to knowing and understanding our own thoughts and feelings and opinions as we go through kind of the story of our lives. Okay? So a first-person narrator just has access to his or her own thoughts and feelings. Doesn't have access to the thoughts and feelings of others, just like each of us individually knows what we think and feel, but doesn't know what anybody else thinks or feels. Now, note as well that even though the narrator doesn't know for sure what other people think and feel, what other characters think and feel, the narrator can describe what's happening to those characters, and the reader can make inferences to understand what the other characters are thinking and feeling. But the narrator can't actually get into those characters' heads and describe what's going on. A third-person narrator can be three things. It can be objective, limited omniscient, or omniscient. Now let's go through each of these different types of access that a third-person narrator can have and explain them in detail. So an objective narrator describes what happens in a story without detailing the internal workings of the characters. This requires the reader to make inferences about the characters' inner lives. So this is a narrator that basically performs much like a video camera would. A video camera takes footage of what's going on, and it takes that footage and it kind of transmits it to somebody who's watching the television screen. And the person watching the television screen can just see what's happening. But they don't actually, as the reader, get inside any of the people that the camera is taking footage of. They can see their faces. The faces can be described by the camera, but the camera doesn't actually ever view the insides of the characters. It doesn't actually go internal. Right? We don't get inside of the characters, we just get the external of the characters. We just see what they look like from the outside. And then again, we're left to make inferences about what those characters in the story might be feeling, what they might be thinking, and what their opinions might be, and their motivations might be. A limited omniscient narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of only one character, giving the reader access to a limited amount of information in the story. So this narrator, you need to make sure that you're limiting your access to only one character. Now it's a little bit easier, I think, to do this perspective because as people we generally want to be able to describe the inner thoughts and feelings of a character, and this gives us one character that we can do that for. So we can go inside the mind of this character. Now the character that we choose to go into, that our narrator can describe the inside of, is usually the protagonist in the story. Okay, or the hero or the heroine of the story, but not always. An omniscient narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of all the characters, giving the reader access to a great amount of information in a story. Now, this narrative perspective can be a little bit difficult to handle because there are so many characters that the narrator has to be aware of. And more than just being aware of those different characters and their thoughts and their feelings, the author really has to be thinking about, okay, when would be a good time to describe this character's thoughts and feelings? And should I just tell what this character is thinking right now, and would that advance the plot in a certain way? And what about if I say what this character over in this other direction is feeling? Would that advance the plot in a certain way? So everything can develop really, really quickly in an omniscient narrator's story because the narrator can tell us about everybody in the story. The narrator can get inside of the minds and the feelings of all of the characters and describe them to the reader. Now note as well our little note on the side which says that the word omniscient is derived from Latin and means all-knowing. So hopefully that helps you remember what these types of narrators have access to. So if you're limited omniscient, you just have one character, and if you're omniscient, you have access to all of the characters. You're all-knowing about all of the characters. Our final aspect that we're talking about that influences how the narrator can tell the story is reliability. Now this is actually a literary term that literary scholars talk about when they're thinking about and writing about different narrators of stories. Now, the first person, let's see how this influences the first person. Because a first-person narrator is a character in the story, he or she tells the story from his or her own subjective perspective. For this reason, the narrator may be unreliable, and the reader may not be able to trust all of what the narrator says. Good readers always consider whether or not they can rely on the voice telling the story to tell the story accurately. So there's a term here that I want everybody to be familiar with, and that term is subjective. Now, when we're talking about a narrator as being subjective, that means we're talking about the narrator as putting his or herself into the story, meaning they can't really take a step back like a third person point of view narrator can do and describe what's going on disinterestedly, not really being a part of it, because this narrator is in the fray. The narrator's in the middle of the story, it's in the middle of the conflict, and the narrator is impacted and influenced and affected by what's going on in the story. So, for that reason, the narrator is going to be subjective, and it may be unreliable, meaning that the reader may not be able to trust all of what the narrator says. So you got to be thinking about that. Is my narrator going to be reliable, or is my narrator going to be unreliable? And being unreliable doesn't necessarily mean that the narrator is dishonest. It could just be, for example, that you have a narrator that is a child, and the child doesn't understand everything that's going on around in the story, and so you get a limited perspective for the reader, and the reader is left to kind of make inferences as best as he or she can about what's going on with the adults in the story, or at least the reader has to be thinking about, maybe the perspective is limited because the narrator is a child. A third-person narrator is usually more reliable and tells the story in a more objective and unbiased manner. Readers can usually trust what a third-person narrator says. So, objective is kind of the opposite of subjective. If you're subjective, you're opinionated. If you're objective, you're factual. So you're describing things that go on in a very fact-based way, much like an encyclopedia would describe things. Okay, so the third-person narrator is able to step away from the story and just describe what's going on without being in the middle of it. And for that reason, the readers can typically trust a third-person narrator most of the time. All right, that is the end of this session of Cornell Notes. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys were able to gain a better understanding of how readers typically use narrators in a story and how these 4 different aspects generally influence a narrator and how the narrator tells a story. Thanks for watching.